No electricity, no batteries, no high-tech gadgets, yet medieval homes had security systems that would impress even modern burglars. Long before we started relying on wires and Wi-Fi, communities found ingenious ways to protect their homes that worked so well, some of their methods are still in use today. Forget everything you think you know about medieval home security. It's way cleverer than you'd expect. You know that feeling when you can't find your phone and panic sets in? Well, medieval folks had slightly bigger concerns, like surviving another day without becoming victim to the plague, getting robbed by highway bandits, or being accused of turning their neighbor's cow inside out through witchcraft. Yes, really, there are actual court records of that last one. Living in medieval times was basically playing life on extreme difficulty settings, but your odds of survival largely depended on whether you were born with a silver spoon or a wooden ladle in your mouth. The wealthy could expect to live into their 40s or 50s, which might sound terrible by today's standards, but trust me, it was quite the achievement back then. They enjoyed protected living spaces, access to whatever passed for medicine, though you might have been better off avoiding those doctors who thought bleeding you with leeches was the answer to everything, and food that wasn't already half-eaten by rats. Speaking of statistics that'll make you appreciate modern life, the rich had about a 60% chance of reaching age 40. Meanwhile, peasants were lucky to make it to their 30s, dealing with everything from backbreaking labor to sharing their living space with livestock. My history professor once joked that medieval peasants had the world's first open concept living arrangement, because there was literally just one room for everything and everyone. But here's where it gets interesting. The threats weren't always what you'd expect. While Hollywood loves showing armies constantly raiding villages, looking at you, every medieval movie ever made, the real killers were much more mundane. Disease outbreaks could wipe out entire neighborhoods faster than you could say, "Bring out your dead." And yes, people actually did say that. Raiders certainly posed a threat to unprotected areas, but you were more likely to die from a workplace accident, like falling off the cathedral you were building or getting tangled up in a windmill. Here's a fact that'll surprise you. According to medieval court records, more people died from tavern brawls than highway robbery. Apparently, arguing over the last mug of ale was serious business. One particularly famous case from 1345 involved a man who died after being hit with a meat pie during a pub argument. Yes, a meat pie. Medieval food was apparently built to last and to serve as impromptu weapons. The rich weren't immune to danger either, though their threats were often more political than physical. While peasants worried about wolves stealing their sheep, nobles had to watch out for rival families plotting to steal their entire estate. At least they could afford guards, unlike the poor fellow who had to rely on his trusty dog and a system of bells that made his house sound like a year-round Christmas celebration. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval safety was how it created a complex social system where your survival often depended on your community as much as your wealth. The poor might not have had strong walls or armed guards, but they developed ingenious ways to protect themselves and their neighbors. Which brings us to one of the most impressive medieval security features, the city walls. These massive stone barriers weren't just for show. They were the difference between sleeping soundly and keeping one eye open all night. When it comes to medieval security systems, city walls were the original gated community. Except instead of keeping out door-to-door salespeople, they were stopping entire armies. These massive stone barriers represented the difference between peaceful sleep and constant paranoia, and took dedication to build that would make modern construction projects blush with shame. Take the walls of York, England, for example, 200 years to complete. That's right, the people who started building those walls never saw them finished. Their great-great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren were the ones who finally got to say, "Look, we finally kept up with the Joneses." Modern contractors complaining about supply chain issues might want to keep that timeline in mind next time they're running a few weeks behind schedule. The fascinating part about medieval city walls wasn't just their size, though at up to 40 feet high and 10 feet thick, they were impressive enough to make any modern security expert whistle in appreciation. It was how they created a complete social hierarchy based on distance from the center. Property values in medieval cities worked exactly opposite to modern suburban sprawl. The further out you went, the worse things got. Rich folks claimed the prime real estate near the city center as far from the walls as possible. This wasn't just about showing off their wealth, though medieval nobles never missed a chance to do that. It was practical thinking at its finest. If enemies breached the walls, the wealthy would have plenty of time to finish their wine, pack their jewels, and make a leisurely escape, while the poor folks near the walls dealt with the immediate chaos. Archaeological evidence shows just how seriously medieval cities took their wall maintenance. York's accounts from 1449 show they spent the equivalent of £300,000 in today's money just on basic repairs. That's like paying for a small mansion, except instead of getting a nice house, you're just making sure your existing wall doesn't fall over. No wonder they had to charge people mirage, a special tax just for wall maintenance. Yes, medieval cities basically had HOA fees, and they were just as popular then as they are now. But walls weren't just about keeping enemies out. They turned cities into controllers of their own destiny. Gates could be closed to keep disease out during plague outbreaks, though medieval germ theory left something to be desired. Regulate trade, fancy paying a toll every time you brought your sheep to market, and even enforce curfews. Many cities had strict rules about gate closure times, leading to more than a few unfortunate souls having to spend the night outside because they lost track of time at the local tavern. The truly intriguing part was how these walls influenced daily life. Every city had its own wall culture, specific rules, traditions, and superstitions. Some believed walking the full circuit of the walls would bring good luck, while others had festivals celebrating wall construction anniversaries. In Chester, it's still technically legal to shoot a Welshman with a bow and arrow from the city walls after midnight, though we strongly recommend not testing that particular medieval law. Not everyone could afford the protection of city walls, of course. For those living outside these stone giants, security meant getting creative with what they had. Medieval peasants might not have had fancy walls, but they made up for it with creativity that would put modern DIY home security enthusiasts to shame. Living outside the city walls or in the dodgy neighborhoods within them meant developing security systems that cost next to nothing, because nothing was exactly what most peasants had. Dogs were the medieval version of a home security system, except instead of sending alerts to your smartphone, they'd wake up the entire village with their barking. These weren't your modern pampered pooches who get scared of their own reflection. Medieval dogs were hardy creatures who earned their keep. Archaeological evidence from peasant settlements shows that most families kept at least one dog, with larger dogs near the door and smaller, yappier ones inside that could raise the alarm if someone got past the first furry line of defense. The real genius came in the form of their bell systems. Modern security companies would charge you hundreds for motion sensors, but medieval peasants created their own alert system using bells, string, and whatever bits of metal they could scrounge up. They'd string these makeshift alarms across doorways and windows, creating a network that would make enough noise to wake the dead if anyone tried breaking in. During one archaeological dig in northern England, researchers found remains of these bell systems made from everything from old pot fragments to damaged church bells that had been borrowed when no one was looking. But the most effective security measure wasn't the dogs or the bells. It was the fact that medieval peasant communities were nosier than a modern neighborhood Facebook group. Houses were built so close together that you couldn't sneeze without three neighbors offering their favorite remedy. This closeness wasn't just poor urban planning, it was intentional. When everyone could hear everything, thieves had a hard time operating undetected. The statistics paint an interesting picture. In one well-documented English village from 1324, court records show that 87% of attempted burglaries were stopped by either a dog's bark or a neighbor's intervention. The remaining 13% were mostly inside jobs. Turns out medieval thieves weren't too keen on robbing houses where they'd have to face both angry dogs and even angrier neighbors armed with farming tools. Some peasants got really creative with their security measures. One documented case from 1350 describes a farmer who trained geese to act as guard animals. Apparently, they were even more effective than dogs because you can't bribe a goose with meat. They'll honk at everyone equally, from actual thieves to the local lord himself. Another clever chap filled hollow reeds with dried peas, creating a medieval version of a motion detector that would rattle if someone stepped on them. Living outside the walls also meant developing a different relationship with darkness. While city folk could rely on night watches and guard patrols, peasants created their own systems for dealing with nighttime security. They'd take turns keeping watch, especially during harvest times when their stored food made them prime targets for thieves. One village even implemented a rotation system where each family had to provide one person for night watch duty. Missing your turn meant you had to pay a fine of 2 chickens to the village fund. These resourceful security measures worked surprisingly well, but they weren't perfect. Sometimes you needed something more substantial than bells and barks. You needed locks. While the wealthy had intricate metal mechanisms to protect their valuables, peasants had to get creative with what they had on hand. The medieval security industry had 2 distinct markets: those who could afford metal locks that would make a modern locksmith jealous, and those who secured their doors with whatever they found in the barn that morning. Archaeological finds have blown away experts with just how sophisticated some medieval locks were, and how creative the simple ones got. Recent discoveries in York unveiled a merchant's house from 1375 with a lock mechanism so complex it used 3 different keys working in sequence. Apparently, medieval locksmiths didn't get the memo about keeping things simple. These locks weren't just functional, they were status symbols. Having a fancy lock on your door was like driving a Ferrari today. Sure, it got the job done, but mostly you wanted everyone to know you could afford it. The wealthy didn't mess around when it came to protecting their valuables. One particularly paranoid nobleman had a chest with 14 different locking mechanisms. Archaeologists found it with 11 still locked. Seems he forgot to write down the combination. Medieval locksmith guilds were so secretive about their techniques that they made modern tech companies look like open-source enthusiasts. Getting into the guild often required making a masterpiece lock that could only be opened by solving a mechanical puzzle. They were basically the escape room designers of their time. But let's talk about how the other 99% lived. Peasants couldn't afford metal locks, but they came up with solutions that worked surprisingly well. The most common was the wooden bar across the door. Simple, effective, and if someone broke it, you could always make another one from that tree behind your house. Some clever folks developed sliding wooden locks with internal pins made from hardwood, creating a poor man's version of a pin tumbler lock. Court records from 1342 mention a farmer who rigged his door with a series of knotted ropes that had to be untied in the right order to get in. It worked great until winter came and the ropes got wet. Then he spent 2 hours trying to get into his own house. Another popular method involved stacking furniture against the door at night. One court case describes a thief who got in through a window but couldn't leave because the homeowner had blocked the door with every piece of furniture they owned, including their grandmother's favorite chair. Churches and monasteries had the most sophisticated security systems of all. The lock on Durham Cathedral's treasury door required 3 different key holders to open it, and they had to do it simultaneously. It was medieval 2-factor authentication, except instead of entering a code from your phone, you had to track down 3 different monks who'd probably taken vows of silence. The really fascinating part is how these locks influenced medieval society. Having the key to the city gates was a big deal. It meant you literally controlled who came and went. Some towns had laws about who could own certain types of locks. In London, for example, apprentice locksmiths caught making unauthorized copies of keys could lose a hand. Talk about strict workplace policies. But even the best locks were useless without someone keeping watch. That's where the night guards came in, though calling them guards might be a bit generous considering some of them were paid in ale. The medieval night watch wasn't exactly what we call a professional police force. These brave or possibly just thirsty souls patrolled the streets after dark, armed with lanterns, wooden clubs, and an impressive tolerance for terrible weather. Their payment often came in the form of bread and ale. Medieval performance bonuses were a lot more straightforward than today's complicated corporate structures. Records from the 1320s London show the night watch system in fascinating detail. The city was divided into 24 wards, each required to provide a certain number of watchmen based on its size and wealth. Rich neighborhoods had to supply more watchmen, which probably seemed unfair until you realized they were the ones with stuff worth stealing. The standard shift ran from sunset to sunrise, with each watchman expected to walk an average of 12 miles per night. No need for medieval gym memberships when your job involved that much cardio. The watchman's calls became a familiar part of medieval nightlife. 10 o'clock and all's well, they'd shout, though sometimes it was more like 3 in the morning and someone's cow was loose again. These calls served multiple purposes. They let honest citizens know the time, warned potential criminals that someone was watching, and kept the watchmen themselves awake. One particularly creative watchman in York became famous for turning his announcements into rhyming couplets. Medieval court records note that local citizens paid him extra to stop. Their equipment was basic but effective. Each watchman carried a lantern, not so much to see by, but to be seen. The idea was to advertise their presence rather than catch criminals in the act. They also carried wooden clubs, though historical records suggest these were used more often to wake up fellow watchmen who dozed off than to fight criminals. Some cities equipped their watch with special rattles or bells to raise the alarm, creating what must have been the medieval version of a police siren, just with more arm cramping and less electricity. The watch didn't just look for criminals, they were medieval Switzerland army knives of public service. They watched for fires, a major threat when most buildings were made of wood, broke up tavern brawls, sometimes by joining them, helped lost drunks find their way home while envying their access to ale, and even acted as impromptu midwives in emergencies. One account from 1389 describes a watchman who delivered a baby, put out a small fire, and caught a chicken thief all in the same night, earning himself an extra ration of ale and a day off to recover from what must have been a very weird shift. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the night watch was their record keeping. Every morning, the head watchman had to report to the local authorities about the night's events. These reports provide some of our best insights into medieval nightlife. From them, we know that the most common crimes weren't dramatic heists or murders, but rather small-time thefts and people trying to sneak into the city after curfew without paying the gate tax. Speaking of crimes and punishments, medieval justice had its own special way of dealing with troublemakers. While watchmen could detain suspects, the real entertainment began when the case went to court. Medieval thieves weren't typically after your PlayStation or smartphone. Their shopping list was decidedly more practical. Court records from the 1300s, England read like a medieval grocery list: bread, cheese, tools, clothing, and occasionally someone's prized chicken. One particularly ambitious thief from Norwich got caught trying to steal an entire cow. He might have gotten away with it too if the cow hadn't mooed at the worst possible moment. The justice system had a unique way of handling these criminals. Many towns operated on what we might call a 3 strikes and you're out policy, except the out part was a lot more permanent than just jail time. First-time offenders might get off with a fine or some time in the stocks. Medieval society's version of a timeout corner, except everyone got to throw rotten vegetables at you. Second offenses often resulted in physical punishment, like having your ears nailed to a post. Don't worry, they'd cut you loose eventually. Third time? Let's just say there wasn't usually a fourth time. But medieval justice wasn't all harsh punishments and ear nailing. The system showed surprising nuance through what historians call the bread rule. If you could prove you stole food because you were starving, courts often showed mercy. Records from 1364 describe a man who stole a loaf of bread getting sentenced to work in the baker's shop instead of losing a hand. The baker later hired him permanently. Medieval rehabilitation at its finest. The punishments themselves often matched the crime in creative ways. Steal from a butcher? Enjoy your new job cleaning the slaughterhouse for a month? Take someone's chickens? You're now responsible for feeding every chicken in town. One clever judge made a wine thief serve as the town crier, standing in the street shouting news and announcements until his voice gave out. Statistics from surviving court records paint an interesting picture. In one well-documented town from 1375, about 60% of thefts involved food or clothing, 30% were tools or household items, and 10% were luxury goods. Apparently, medieval thieves were practical folks who'd rather steal a warm cloak than a golden goblet. The conviction rate was surprisingly high, around 70%, mainly because it was hard to be sneaky in a community where everyone knew what color socks you owned. The wealthy didn't get off easy either, though their punishments usually involved their wallets rather than their appendages. One noble caught stealing from a merchant had to pay back triple the value and fund the town's festivities for a year. The merchant apparently made sure that year's festival was extra extravagant. Medieval court records reveal some truly bizarre cases. A man in Canterbury was caught stealing his neighbor's door. Just the door, nothing else. His defense? He claimed the door had blown off in the wind and landed in his yard, and he was just keeping it safe. Another thief tried to steal a beehive but got caught because, well, angry bees aren't exactly subtle accomplices. The most effective deterrent wasn't the punishment itself, but the public shame that came with it. In a world without television or internet, watching someone stand in the stocks was premium entertainment. People would gather around to heckle the condemned, turning punishment into performance art. One town even had a designated shame bell that rang whenever someone was caught stealing, ensuring everyone knew to come watch the show. Through all these measures, walls, dogs, bells, locks, watchmen, and creative punishments, medieval communities managed to create a surprisingly effective security system. It might not have been high-tech, but it had something better: human ingenuity and a strong sense of community justice.